We're now going to talk about some other artists from Venice in the 16th century, Tintoretto, Veronese, and Palladio. Jacopo Robusti is known to us as Tintoretto. And the name Tintoretto, his nickname, means little dyer. His father dyed cloth for a living. He had a sign in his studio that said that he combined the drawing, the disegno of Michelangelo, and the colore, the color of Titian. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that's accurate or not. He is a kind of virtuoso. He can paint very fast, and he does not use disegno in his paintings. He paints with a very free brushwork. He does do a lot of drawings, but they also are quite free in his painting. Most of his paintings are oil paint on canvas, and we're going to look at one of his last paintings. It's his last Supper. He did paint a number of paintings of the Last Supper. This was painted in the last years of his life, from 1592 to 1594. So it's right near the end of the 16th century. Tintoretto had a large workshop. His sons and his daughter were also painters. So sometimes you'll see work by Tintoretto that may not be as the high quality that you see of other Tintorettos, and it may be that that's the work of Domenico, or one of his sons. His daughter, her name was Marietta, and she's known as Marietta Robusti, or sometimes La Tintoretta. His daughter also worked in his studio. Unfortunately, when she was married, she died in childbirth. And this, of course, was something that frequently happened to women before the days of birth control and better medical attention. But obviously that would be something that would end a woman's career. Tintoretto worked extremely rapidly. He was known as Il Furioso, the furious one. He painted furiously. And one of the things he would do was use a very dark background. Really dark brown, looks black frequently in reproductions. And then he basically would paint the highlights on it. He has a very painterly, very free painting style. So when you look at this Last Supper, you'll notice that the background is this very dark color. And then you'll see he's painted the rafters over the dark color. It's just basically the highlights. And then he's painted the angels over that. So you can see both the ground, which is this dark color, and the painted rafters beneath the angels, who are really just painted with highlights. He saves himself time by painting the highlights and uses the ground as the darkest color in his composition. So you have this very strong contrast of light and dark. You'll also notice that this painting is based on diagonal movement. The table of the Last Supper it looks like it goes back into space on a diagonal. And we find Christ because he's close to the center of the picture, but he's got this radiance around him, this glow of light. The halo is a kind of aura. And you may notice that the other apostles also have glows of light rather than gold disc halos or golden circles around their head. It's as though they're glowing with light. Now, I should point out few other things about this painting. You'll notice that it has a lot of servants. The Venetians liked to embellish. And in their paintings of the Last Supper, they decided that Jesus was probably borrowing the upper room from a wealthy man, and surely he would have provided servants to serve the meal. So you have essentially all of these extras. But it's kind of interesting how, notice the figures standing at the front. These are the servants, and yet they're larger than the sacred figures. This kind of reversal of what you might expect sometimes is seen as a mannerist characteristic. And you might also notice that some of the standing figures seem to be slightly elongated. Tintoretto has been called a mannerist, and I think your book has him as late Renaissance. So for examinations, I would accept either answer, Renaissance or mannerism. And here you see the details. You can see that some of the strokes of paint, particularly with the angels. And you have this feeling of excitement and drama because of the strong contrast of light and dark, because of that dramatic diagonal movement, and because of the freeness of the brush strokes. We're all familiar with Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. We had that earlier in the course. So some of you may say, well, why is this so different than Leonardo's Last Supper? Why is there so much drama here? Aren't they both Renaissance works of art? Well, of course, there's many painters painted the Last Supper, probably hundreds of them. And each of them used their own personal style and the style and the stylistic characteristics of their period or place. So this is Tintoretto's personal style. It's dramatic. He uses a lot of diagonal movement. He uses a strong contrast of light and dark. And some of the characteristics, of course, we now associate with Venice in the 16th century. We think of asymmetry and loose brushwork as being, Venetian. And of course, that's because of artists like Titian and Tintoretto using them. But I also might suggest that Tintoretto has offered a different interpretation of the subject of the Last Supper. That essentially he's saying something different about the subject matter. And that has to do with the time in which it was created. So, why so much excitement? Well, with Leonardo's Last Supper, we said, what moment is portrayed? And with Leonardo's, we said, well, this is the moment when Christ announces that one of the apostles will betray me. And there's all this consternation. It's a very human drama. And we said it's the moment of greatest mental or psychological tension. And we contrasted that to Ghirlandaio's Last Supper, in which the betrayer is being identified. No mystery. It's Judas. But this is not either of those moments. He's not saying one of you will betray me. He's not saying, here it is. It's he to whom I give the sop. We can find Judas fairly easily if we know the tradition. Notice where the maidservant in the foreground is, and just right up above her, there is a figure kneeling on the opposite side of the table from the other apostles. And of course, that's the traditional place for Judas. He's often placed on the other side of the table. So that's Judas. He doesn't have a halo. And you might notice Jesus isn't paying any attention to him. What's he doing? So here you see the detail with the radiance around Christ and around the disciple that's seated next to him. There's a smaller glow of light. And Jesus is putting his hands very close to the mouth of the apostle next to him. What he's doing is offering Holy Communion. He's putting the wafer in the mouth of the apostle next to him. So the moment that's shown here is the institution of the Holy Sacrament, or the institution of the Eucharist. The sacrament of the bread and wine has many names in Christianity. It's called the Mass in the Catholic Church, the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving, the sacrament of the bread and wine, the Holy Sacrament, of course there are others, Holy Communion. And this is the institution of that sacrament. It's one of the sacraments that the Catholic Church considers to be efficacious. In other words, it works. It's effective. It helps you get into heaven. The other one is baptism. Both of these are efficacious sacraments. So, I'm suggesting that beyond being Tintoretto's personal style, which it certainly is, that the dramatic style and composition enhance the message of the painting, the iconography of the painting. So what's he saying about the institution of the Eucharist? Okay. Now, I want you to think about the time in which this painting was painted. What's happened in religious history during the 16th century? Leonardo painted his Last Supper in the 1490s. Tintoretto is painting this Last Supper in the 1590s. What happened? The Protestant Reformation happened. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the doors of Wittenberg Church, and these were against indulgences. And I'm sure he didn't know what was going to happen from that action. But from that beginning and from other disagreements he had with what was going on at the time, there became a split in the Christian church. There'd already been another split, the split between East and West. So you have the Catholic Church in the West, the Latin Church, and the Orthodox or Greek Church in the East. But in the 16th century, another split, the split in Western Christianity, occurred. So what does this have to do with the interpretation of the sacrament of the Last Supper? Some Protestants, and here I should explain that there's about 3 different ideas about what this sacrament is about, the sacrament of the bread and wine. We'll be talking about the Catholic view, and there's essentially 2 Protestant views. Luther thought that he believed in something called consubstantiation, that the bread and the wine were really the body and blood of Christ, but they were also bread and wine. But some Protestants went even further. These are sometimes called the radical Protestants. And they denied that the bread and the wine of the sacrament were truly the body and blood of Christ. Well, what do you suppose the Catholics thought about that? They disagreed, and it wasn't a friendly disagreement at all. The Catholics believed that the Protestants were heretics. And in reaction to Protestantism, the Catholic Church had a church council called the Council of Trent, and it was a Counter-Reformation council against the Reformation. In this council, one of the things they did, we'll hear some other things later, was reaffirm key Catholic doctrines that the Protestants opposed. And one of these was the doctrine of transubstantiation. What's transubstantiation? According to Catholic doctrine, the Eucharistic sacrifice, the sacrifice of the bread and wine, the Holy Communion, is in some way truly the body and blood of Christ, under the appearance of bread and wine. Let me explain that a little more. You can see the word says transubstantiation. And so the substance is changed. It's a mystery. It's a miracle that during the celebration of the Mass, when the consecration, the words that the priest says to consecrate the bread and the wine, that in some manner the substance of this bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ. What we need to do is think about what the Bible says about the Last Supper. And during the Last Supper, and of course this is repeated in the sacrament of the bread and wine, Christ takes the bread. He breaks it. He says, "This is my body, which is broken for you." He takes the wine and he blesses it. And he says, "This is my blood, which is shed for you for the remission of sins." And he says, "Take this and eat, take this and drink." And then he says, "Do this in memory of me." So you can see that the Catholic interpretation was basing it on the words, "This is my body, this is my blood." And the Protestants, what they sometimes call the radical Protestants or the low church Protestants, not what would today be the Episcopalians or the Lutherans, which are the high church, that most of the Protestant denominations that are today would say, but it's done in memory of Christ. It's simply symbolically, the body and blood of Christ. It's not really flesh or blood. It's a memorial service. They regard it as a sacrament. But the idea of recreating the crucifixion and of the miracle of the change of the bread and wine to the body and blood of Christ, they say, no, that's not so. It's simply done as a memorial, and it is simply symbolic. Okay. What do you think? Does Tintoretto's painting support the Protestant view or the Catholic view or interpretation of the sacrament? And think about what's going on there. You've got angels flying in. You've got a lot of drama going on. And a little hint here. Tintoretto is a Venetian. Who is he painting this for? He's painting this for a monastery church, the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore, which is in Venice. Okay, Tintoretto's Last Supper is a Catholic reaffirmation of the miracle of transubstantiation. If someone hasn't attacked an idea, and it's widely believed, you don't have to defend it. But now that idea of transubstantiation has been attacked, and the Counter-Reformation reaffirms it. They say this is something you have to take on faith. It's a mystery. It's a miracle. And that seems to be what Tintoretto is showing us. You have drama and excitement in the style, dramatic diagonals, lots of contrast of light and dark. And you also have supernatural elements, such as the angels who are flying in. And you might notice this hanging oil lamp Around it, you have what seems to be smoke. And then if you look closer at it, they're angels. Now, the smoke has been transformed into angelic form. So all of these exciting supernatural elements suggest a miracle. Here you see the detail of that. And of course, you have a reaction of the apostles and the servants. As you can see, one of the apostles has put his hands together. Another one has them apart, sort of in wonder. When people go up to take Holy Communion, they often put their hands together in a prayerful gesture. Then there's that reaction of the apostle, then there's that reaction of the two servants who are right in front. The maidservant is holding up a vessel containing little round white things. And the male servant is sort of drawing up himself. He's almost going, whoa, like, oh, such a big surprise. Something's happened here. What could those little white things be? Well, frequently during communion service, whether it's Protestant or Catholic, you can just use bread, but they sometimes create a wafer of bread. And they're made in in the 16th century, they were made in little press molds, and they were circular. Some of them would have designs in them, like a cross, for example, or some other Christian symbols. They're still made today that way, probably not as individual little presses, but manufactured en masse, perhaps. And these round white wafers would be the bread of the Eucharist. So is it possible that what she's holding up is meant to remind us of these wafers of the Eucharist, and the servant is somehow realizing that they've been transformed? It's acting like there's something surprising going on with that. Possibly. And so here you see a very dramatic rendition of the Last Supper, the institution of the Holy Sacrament. Well, a bit earlier, 1573, Paolo Veronese painted a Last Supper. It's quite different than Tintoretto's in some ways. There's the similarity of having lots of servants. In fact, he has even more servants, and are they guests, or who are all these people here? We see a loggia, a sort of open porch, with the table stretched out across three openings, three arches. And we see Christ in the center with, we'll see this close later on, John on one side, Peter on the other. And then you see all of these different figures. And let me tell you where Tintoretto's Last Supper is placed. It is a huge painting. As I said, it's in the church of San Giorgio Maggiore. It's not directly behind the altar, but behind the altar, which is where I assume the choir of monks would have sat. On either side of the wall is a large painting. The Last Supper is on one side, and the Old Testament prefiguration for the Last Supper, the gathering of the manna, is another painting by Tintoretto on the other side. Here we're going to see another version of the Last Supper. This is by Paolo Veronese, and it was painted about 20 years before Tintoretto's, in 1573. It is a huge canvas. It is 42 feet wide. And as you can see, you have Renaissance architecture here with these. The Last Supper is taking place in a kind of loggia, a kind of open porch, so we can look out over the city. And we see the table stretched throughout three openings with Christ in the center. And here, detail of the center, we see Christ leaning toward St. John. On the other side is St. Peter, flanking Christ. And then that figure in red who sort of leans back in his seat. This would be Judas in his traditional place, on the opposite side of the table from Christ. But Christ's not paying any attention to Judas. He's not identifying the betrayer here or even announcing that anyone will betray him. And you'll notice there's a lot of other figures. These are the servants. There's also several dogs and a cat. Dogs and cats are very frequent in paintings of the Last Supper. You may have noticed them in Tintoretto's painting. Some people think that they are supposed to represent the antagonism between Judas and Christ. But in this case, where there's several of them, maybe they're embellishments. There's a lot of embellishments, not only the lavish Renaissance architecture, which would be appropriate to a very, very wealthy Venetian, but he has servants. He has dwarves. If you look between those columns, you see a man picking his teeth. You see all sorts of embellishments. I wonder if the man with the green cloth with his arms outstretched, could he be the host, or is he the steward of the feast, making sure that everything goes smoothly? And here we see the other side, where you have even some soldiers with pikes, guards around the house, and more servants bringing in the food. The story of this is really interesting. What happened was the artist was called before the Inquisition. Why? Okay, we mentioned the Council of Trent. This was the Counter-Reformation church council in the mid-16th century, and they made a lot of rulings. There were some things that needed to be cleaned up, like simonry, so they would make rulings about that. There were doctrines that had been attacked by the Protestants, so they reaffirmed Catholic doctrine. But one of the rulings they made was that religious art must be decorous. Now, what did they mean by decorous? They meant that it had to be dignified and appropriate to the subject. And Paolo Veronese, and I should mention that his name, Veronese, means that he came from Verona. So he's working in Venice, but he came from Verona. He actually works a lot around northern Italy. So Paolo Veronese is called before the Inquisition because, they say, his Last Supper is not decorous. Why isn't it decorous? Well, it's because there are servants and dwarves and dogs and all these people, a person picking his teeth and all these extraneous figures. It doesn't seem very sacred. It doesn't seem very decorous. So, how did Veronese defend himself? Veronese pleaded what we would call poetic license. He says, among other things, we painters take the same license that poets and jesters take. I paint pictures as I see fit, and as well as my talent permits. What do you think? Do you think the inquisitors agreed with him? Not likely. The verdict was that the painting was not decorous, and Veronese was ordered to change the painting and eliminate all of the figures that are not decorous, that detract from the sacred meaning of the Last Supper. Okay, think about that for a minute. That painting is huge. It's 42 feet wide. He's not going to be paid all the time he's supposed to repaint this picture. How can he possibly do this? What he did was change the title. And can you see in the molding above in this detail, it's on the far right, your right, below the young servant with a large vessel there. Can you see Luca says, CAP, abbreviating for chapter, and the V, of course, is the Roman numeral 5. So he simply painted a Bible verse, and a reference to a Bible verse, not to the whole verse. He simply painted the biblical source on the balustrade and called the painting The Feast in the House of Levi. How'd he get away with that? Well, Levi was a rich man. He was a tax collector. And Christ is eating at the house of Levi, who eventually becomes the apostle and changes his name to Matthew. And the idea is, well, this is no longer a sacrament. And since it's a rich man's house, of course he can have servants and dwarves and dogs and anything he wants. It's not a sacrament, so it's not indecorous. It's just a feast in a rich man's house. And he got away with it. Which suggests that the Venetian Inquisition was not as stringent as perhaps the Spanish Inquisition. So now we have the feast in the house of Levi from Luke chapter 5. I want to talk to you about an architect who works in Venice. He's actually from Vicenza, which is in Venetian territory, and he works in Vicenza. He also works in Venice. He's known as Palladio. And the first work we're going to look at is this church, San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. It's on an island. If you're standing, between the Ducal Palace and the library designed by San Savino, and you look out over the bay, you will see San Giorgio Maggiore. It's where Tintoretto's Last Supper is housed, and it's the monastery church for which Tintoretto's Last Supper was painted. Palladio is actually a nickname. He had a humanist patron, and the patron gave him a classical education and a classical nickname. So he's named for Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom. He was a working architect, but he also was an architectural theorist. In other words, he wrote a book about architecture, and it's called The Four Books of Architecture. And in it, he talks about the classical proportions. And this was a very influential book. There were several books on architecture that influenced neoclassical architects of the 18th century, including Thomas Jefferson. One was Vitruvius's 10 Books of Architecture. Vitruvius was a first century Roman, first century BCE Roman architect. And the other book that was so influential was Palladio's 4 Books of Architecture. So here we're looking at San So here we're looking at San Giorgio Maggiore. We're on the Vaporetto, or the water bus, and we're traveling to the church. In fact, I'll tell you, my father took this photograph when we were on the Vaporetto traveling to the church, and I have always been amazed, because you can see how choppy the water was, that it came out in focus. And here we're looking at the nave inside. You can see rounded arches, classical columns, engaged columns and rounded arches, and of course a hemispheric dome above the crossing of the church. And I want you to notice that this church has a long nave, or main aisle, and crossing it is the transept, or cross arms. And then it has a lower section, which would be the side aisles. Palladio's church of San Giorgio Maggiore exemplifies his solution for a problem in creating a Christian church facade in a classical style. Most Christian churches will have a tall hallway in the center, known as the nave, and then on either side there will be a lower side aisle. And at the top part of the nave there's usually windows, called a clerestory. So essentially you've got two levels. And of course, you've got lots of space inside, because in a Christian church, people come inside for their worship. They have congregational worship, and they don't usually meet outside the way they did in ancient Rome. Now, in ancient Rome, the sacrifices and ceremonies would be performed outside. The temple would have a room to house the statue of the god. And this would be at the back of the temple, and then in front of it would be a portico, or porch, that would have columns, an entablature or lintel, and a pediment, which would be the triangular gable that you see here. You don't have two different levels. So, what does Palladio do? He creates two superimposed classical temple facades. In other words, where the nave is, the tall central hallway, he has a pediment, an entablature, engaged columns, because this really isn't a porch, it's actually a wall there. And you'll notice that he puts the columns on pedestals or plinths. That's because if they were very long and came all the way down to the ground, the proportions would be wrong. He's very aware of classical proportions, which are based on the proportions of the human being. So he raises the columns up on plinths. And then on either side, he has this low gable. It looks like there's a squat temple behind the facade with the engaged columns that is the nave. But of course, what's really happening is he's just having the end of the gable, which does not really meet, but that covers up the side aisles. And then he uses classical motifs such as pilasters, his little statues, little niches there, to create the appearance of a low temple facade. So it looks like there's two temple facades, one put on top of the other. And it's a very elegant way of solving this problem about the two height part of the facade of a Christian church. Palladio also created palazzi, monumental homes in the city, and a villa. This is known as the Villa Rotunda or the Villa Capri. It's in Vicenza, which is Palladio's home city. It's we call it the Veneto, the area around Venice. It's not real close to Venice, but it's in the general area. And this is the home of a wealthy person in the country. If you're living in the city, it's a palazzo. If you're living in the country, it's a villa. And, of course, very wealthy people had both palazzi and villae. So it's domestic architecture for a rich man, his country house. Now, this also reflects classical design. Remember what we said about Renaissance architects, that they use classical architectural elements and they use them in new ways. In this case, we can see very clearly that the Pantheon is the model. But of course, it has to be adapted because Palladio is creating a home. He's not creating a temple here. But you can see that the facades have a great deal of similarity. You have a pediment, that's the triangular gable, and a tablature or architrave, which is the horizontal lintel. You have a series of columns, and you can't see it on the Pantheon, but you did have a stairway leading up. The ground level has risen since the Pantheon was created in the early 2nd century. And so they've had to excavate down. And so when you go to the Pantheon, first you have to walk down and then you have to walk up the steps. But there originally were steps leading up to it that you could see. You'll also notice that the Pantheon has a rotunda. The temple itself is round. And it has a hemispheric dome, but from the outside, the only thing you can see is sort of the saucer of the very top of the dome. And that's because it is encased in concrete. And to support the dome of the Pantheon, you have very, very heavy walls, and the dome itself gets narrower and narrower as you go to the top. When we look at Palladio's Villa Rotunda, we see a similar facade. We have pediments, entablature, columns, a staircase leading up, and we can see that there is a dome of which we can just see the top of. We can also see, however, that there is a kind of square section and that these porches are they're on all 4 sides of the villa. So he's used the centralized dome. He's used 4 temple facades. Here he's using Ionic columns. Those are the columns with the scroll work on it. And so you have this perfectly symmetrical building. In the center is a rotunda, in other words, a round room, which is surmounted by a hemispheric dome. Because this is a home, however grand, you need more than one room. And so he's used a square to give you additional rooms. It's perfectly symmetrical from every side and very much a centralized building. Palladio's Villa Rotunda was very influential on 18th century English and American country houses. On the left, you see Lord Burleigh's Chiswick House in West London. And on the right, you see a building that you may have visited. It's Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, near Charlottesville, Virginia. And we'll talk about those when we get to neoclassicism in the 18th century.